This afternoon we're joined via satellite link from the new US Federal Office or Administration for Community Living. Kathy Greenlee is here. Oh, she was here. Okay. She can follow. She's watching. Okay, welcome Kathy. And we're also joined by our Minister of State, Brian Hayes. He's Minister of State for Public Service, Reform and the Office of Public Works, and he's going to chair this afternoon. We have three presentations. The first one from our colleague from the European Commission, Andor, Ürmös, will be setting out for you how the regulations are structured, how they're governed. Not an easy thing to communicate, but nevertheless vitally important. I'll talk to you a little bit about the proposals from the Commission and the current negotiations and some of the big questions that remain as the negotiations enter into their climactic phase. And then we will hear from Ines Bulic, I believe, about the toolkit and about the practical tools that are available, provided we can get the regulations right. And then, of course, we'll hear from our American colleagues about how they have gone about bringing together their funding streams in a very coherent manner across ageing and disability to achieve community living for all. So, Minister, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great privilege to be here in University College Galway at this very important conference this afternoon. When my good friend Senator Catherine Zaffone asked me to come down to Galway to chair one of your sessions this afternoon, I was delighted to do so. I think it was part of her strategy to get me to commit to some funding here, because this morning, as I understand, Minister Lynch was here setting out the government's policies and plans in terms of the areas that she has responsibility for. I'm really the baddie in all of this because I have responsibility for the budget. And in the current circumstances, we're in a difficult position, needless to say. But I have no doubt that Senator Zaffone's strategy will work out as it always does, because she's hugely successful at these things in getting her way, which is very important as well. Can I say this is a very interesting collaboration, and it comes at a very useful time. One of the key issues that we face in our discussions as President of the European Union between now and the end of June is how do we move the current negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework, which is of course the next 7-year financial envelope for the European Union. And while Council and heads of government have agreed a budget plan for the next 7 years, of course with co-decision making from the European Parliament, we are still locked in negotiations with the EU Parliament to come to some agreement. And that agreement is important, I think, in two respects. Firstly, it will be a very bad day indeed for the European Union if we cannot come to agreement, because given the crisis that we have come through in the course of the last number of years, if the European Union cannot agree a financial framework for the next 7 years, it doesn't send out a very positive signal. So it's important that we come to an agreement. But secondly, and I think more importantly, the EU budget in itself is an important stimulus tool for investment right the way across the European Union. And the structural funds and the cohesion funds within that are an example of how we as Europeans can spend money in key areas of policy. 2 weeks ago I was before the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and one of my tasks in representing the Council on that occasion was to justify expenditure patterns from the publication of the budget and audits that came in 2011. Yes, they are difficult times that we're living through. Every euro that we spend has got to be audited in a way to prove that we obtain added value from that expenditure. But I also believe it's important that we need to stretch that expenditure and do it in a way which gets maximum value for money. And I think what's very interesting about this conference, in what you're trying to achieve, in looking at how we can adapt structural funding for social purposes, particularly in the area of independent living, is a very useful and innovative way that we can use those funds over the course of the next 7 years or so. And we do need to look at international best practice, how that funding stream has been used in other parts of the world. I'm interested to hear later how it is applied in the course of the United States of America. I'll give just one statistic, and it's an important statistic, and it highlights where we have got to go in developing policy in this area. The CSO figures indicate that the number of people over the age of 65 will rise from its current levels of about 500,000 to 1.3 million by 2041. And by 2041, the number of people aged 80 years or over is projected to increase from its current level of about 120,000 people to 450,000 people. So we know from the demographics within our country, in terms of producing new policy and funding streams attached to that policy, that we have got to adapt, we have got to change, and it is only logical and right that we need to put in place more funding streams for community and independent community living for people with a disability, or for older people in particular. I say that because our country, more than any country in the world, I suspect, has a very dark past. In the earlier times of the foundation of this state, we saw the way in which people were incarcerated, the appalling conditions that was meted out to people who didn't fit in with the norms as was then determined at that time. So I think we have a responsibility as legislators, as policymakers, to devise a creative way in which independent living can be a fundamental new part of a policy that we want to devise. No longer can people be hidden away in institutions. No longer can people be forgotten about. We have a responsibility to ensure the highest quality of standard of living, of well-being for all our citizens. And if the European Union funding streams can help us in that regard, I think as policymakers and legislators, we have a responsibility to look at that in the most novel and innovative way possible. I was told in coming here to Galway, this isn't about spending more money, but it's about spending money differently. And wearing my Department of Finance hat, that's music to our ears, you'll be glad to hear. Once we can get the value for money and efficiencies right, there is no reason why we shouldn't look with a new prism and a new focus on how we can achieve that. So with those few words, ladies and gentlemen, it's my task to be Chairman-in-Chief, as I understand, till about 3:30 this afternoon. So it's a great privilege for me to ask our first speaker to come to the podium and to make his presentation. Andor Ürmös is a policy analyst from DG Regional and Urban Policy within the European Union, and I understand he's going to speak to us about the regulation of the structural funds and the current state of the negotiations. And I'm very interested to hear about that, given the fact that I think next week I'll be in Brussels trying to make sure that those negotiations on the MFF come to some logical conclusion. Anders, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I think it's really a very important conference, and I think it's really timely organized because, as it was previously said many times, actually we are really in the middle of the negotiations. We are really in the middle of making very important decisions, and today we can share our views and we can discuss how we see actually different positions, which I would like to highlight in my presentations. After lunch, I think it's very difficult to follow anyway a presentation, but my presentation full of Euro jargon, so sorry for that. But I try to simplify this as much as possible and to give you a very practical view how we see the negotiations and what kind of problems we are facing now to improve the efficiency of the structural funds allocations and not to continue some bad habits what we have been doing together with the member states in the current programming period. I would like to start, if this works. Yes, I would like to start with this map, which you know very well probably. This is about the allocation of structural funds in the new programming period. But here, I would like to emphasize one thing. We are focusing on the Eastern European countries, on the so-called less developed plus transition regions. 80% of the structural funds is allocated to these two types of regions, the transition regions and the less developed regions. It's very important to understand that when we are discussing actually the structural funds, we are more focusing on the Eastern European countries and not too much on the Western European countries. It doesn't mean that we forget about actually the Western European countries, but we have to follow much more what's going on in Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary, Slovakia than let's say in Germany or in the UK. There's one more important message on the slide, that comparing to the current budget, we will have less, probably. I mean, you know, as it was already said, actually, the negotiations are still going on, but we will have less budget because of the reduced budget. And the second thing is we have to share actually the budget amongst 28 member states, because Croatia is joining. So member states, they would accept actually less budget than in the current programming. However, if you see the figures, what is really available in this current programming period, you can see that actually it's quite a significant budget. It's 17.9 billion euros what member states right now actually allocating to social infrastructure, comprising education, health, childcare and housing infrastructure. And here we are discussing about the deinstitutionalization. Because we are discussing childcare infrastructure, we are discussing health infrastructure, and here we see some problems that member states, they do not really focus on the deinstitutionalization, they are more focusing on the refurbishment of the existing institutions. I put here a specific reference on e-inclusion because I think it's a very important investment category. It's 5.3 billion euros, which member states, they can use actually to provide community-based services and to provide e-health, e-services for people who are living in a community. I have to tell you that this measure, it's not really used for the deinstitutionalization, and we would like to reinforce it even again in the next programming period, because this is a very important budget, and in regards of health infrastructure, e-health, this could be actually the new way to promote community-based services. I put some comments here on this slide but just for information, you know it very well that we have raised already some concerns with colleagues of the European Expert Group, in particular Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, but we can continue this list. There are some, let's say, bad investments what we would like to change in the future. You know very well that, for example, in Bulgaria, however, the action plan was very much appreciated by everybody, but right now there is a huge debate whether the small groups homes for 12 or 14 children, this is the right way to allocate structural funds or not. In Hungary, the debate is going on whether these institutions up to 50 people, this is the right way to allocate structural funds. And in Romania, yeah.
Just a quick comment that in Hungary the debate is going on also about group funds.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And concerning Romania, we just made a kind of list of projects where we have seen that some refurbishment of disability and mental health institutions were implemented with quite significant budgets. And I think this is the very important slide where I would like to show you where we are and what we are planning to do in the next couple of months, or even in this month, because this month is really a very important month for us. Why? Because you know that we have released the draft regulations in October 2011. And as we have heard today many times, the Danish presidency has made some modifications of this regulatory package. We have issued the position papers. I will come back to these position papers later. We have issued these position papers. What are the priorities for us by member states? And this was issued in October, November last year. The trilogue has been opened, where the European Parliament, the Commission, and the Council, the three of these organizations, they are discussing actually the current regulations. We are waiting for the Irish presidency conclusions. We are waiting for the, let's say, the reflections from the Council, how they see actually the regulations. Meantime, the bilateral informal dialogues has been launched, so we have already discussed some priorities with member states concerning the institutionalization, for example. And we are expecting actually the approval of the regulations by October, November this year. It's maybe not realistic, but this is what we are expecting, because without the regulations, of course, member states, they cannot really program the new structural funds programs. Concerning the draft regulatory package, I just would like to repeat some questions, some measures which we have included in the regulations, but I think it's important to understand, as Ima emphasized in her presentations, that we have made a giant step ahead, because we have made it very clear and explicit that we would like to reinforce as much as possible the community-based services in the new structural funds programs. So you see here actually that in the context of the common provision regulations. This is the general regulations which actually regulates all the 5 funds. I don't want to make a list of all of these funds, but this is which covers actually everything what we call EU funds. And here we are discussing actually under the thematic objective promoting social inclusion and combating poverty, how to allocate funds for the institutionalization. We have introduced some ex-ante conditionalities, you know very well, the thematic one under the national poverty reduction strategy, which was taken out by the Danish presidency, and on the next slide, the general ex-ante conditionality on the implementation of the UN Convention, which was also taken out by the Danish presidency. Right now, we still keep our position that these 2 important ex-ante conditionality measures should be in the regulations. So our position has not changed. The question, and which we know that the EP, the European Parliament, is pushing very much, actually, to put it back. We are still waiting for the reactions from the Irish presidency. We are waiting how the member states they would like to react on that and how they see this question. You may know that the main debate about the ex-ante conditionalities is about that we are too prescriptive as we go beyond the competences of the European Commission. That's why member states they say that no, these are too much for us. We would like to see actually how you are working, let's say, in your area. You should not go beyond of your competences. But the ex-ante conditionality measure, it's very important for us just because, as I said, we have seen some not so efficient investments, and we have to change our focus. We have to improve our efficiency. That's why the ex-ante conditionalities, the so-called strategies, have been introduced. And this gives us an opportunity to see the strategic background of the investments. But we are talking about educational policies, we are talking about social policies, we are talking about health policies, which is not the competence of the European Union to make, let's say, modification of the particular health policy in a member state. So this discussion is about how we can make amendments of the health policy or the social policy. But we see this question from the investments point of view. If you would like to invest in your health system, you have to discuss with us your health system, your reform, the whole strategic background. If you don't want to invest in health infrastructure, let's give this example, then fine, we don't want to make any comments, any recommendations for you how you should actually amend your system. But if you understand well, actually in the new programming period, all the member states, I'm talking about mostly the Eastern Europeans, they would like to invest in health. So if they invest in health, we have to discuss the strategic background. If they want to invest in childcare, we have to discuss how the social policy will be, let's say, amended, or how they see these questions. You know that we have, by the current state of play of the regulations, we have an opportunity actually to suspend the payments if the ex-ante conditionalities has not been submitted by the end of 2016. This is quite strict, but we try to make it to make it practical. So, for example, I just give you one example of Poland. Poland just raised the question that they have a health strategy, but it's a bit of scattered, so you can see actually the health strategy in all different documents. And we just said, we are absolutely fine with that, just please put it together. We would like to see the context in one paper, how you really focus on the transformation of your health system. And they will accept it as the fulfillment of the ex-ante conditionality. So we should not be too much prescriptive, but on the other hand, if Poland would like to invest in health, we have to see the health strategy. Again, these are the justifications that we changed our focus concerning the ESF, the European Social Fund, and concerning the European Regional Development Fund regulations, where the investment priorities are quite clear concerning the transition to community-based services. And I would like to emphasize here that member states, they have not raised any objections concerning that, and it's good news. So it means that, for example, for the ERDF regulations, probably we will keep this investment priority. They don't want to take it out from the current regulatory package. This is a sad story. there are some good news and bad news. This is a bit of bad news, the common strategic framework, because as it was already mentioned in the previous presentations, in the common strategic framework we have identified some key actions. I just put here some ERDF, some Regional Development Fund key actions, which could be important and very relevant for deinstitutionalization. But unfortunately, the future of the common strategic framework, it's a bit unclear, because it seems that the Council decided as common strategic framework will not be delegated to the regulations, so it's disappeared more or less, these key actions. It's bad because we wanted to continue to focus on these key actions, and we wanted to see actually these key actions in the structural funds programs. But the good news is that we have agreed that these key actions will be implemented in the thematic guidances, what we are producing for the member states. So these key actions we try to keep them alive as much as possible. Yeah, and here you see, actually, we had a very explicit mentioning that CSF funds may not be used for actions contributing to any form of segregation and discrimination. So that would be very, very important for us. But again, this common strategic framework will not work as we have planned. We will have a thematic guidance. I will come back to this issue a bit later. And some speakers have already mentioned the role of integrated programming. This is something what we would like to promote as much as possible, to use together the social fund, the regional development fund, the rural development fund. And concerning the deinstitutionalization, we have seen some good experiences in Bulgaria, for example, or in Slovakia. We have seen some traces of some good examples. But in the future, we are happy to see an overall integrated operational program where all the funds are working together. Actually, in the today, tomorrow, the two commissioners, Commissioner Andor and Commissioner Hahn, they are sending actually some formal information to the member states that we are really expecting some integrated programs for the future, because this is what we would like to see. Okay, and some concrete and very practical things. We have reviewed the position papers just recently, what the Commission has said to the member states about the shift to the community-based care. Concerning the health infrastructure, you see here the list of member states who have, in this case, we have identified the need for reinforcing actually the shift to the community-based care. These are our intentions, these are our priorities, and that was communicated to the member states last October and November, that please take it into the consideration when you are drafting your programs. I put here a special bullet point under the health infrastructure that reform is a condition for further financing in some cases. Bulgaria and Slovakia, these are the most important cases where if we don't see an appropriate focus on the health reform, the Commission has raised the question, maybe we will not invest in health infrastructure at all in Bulgaria and in Slovakia. This is again quite strict, but looking at the current investments, we have to admit that some investments were not so efficient in Bulgaria and in Slovakia, and I can continue actually with Poland. And if we would like to improve or the efficiency of our investments, we have to change the strategic background of this, which means actually we would like to see how the whole system will be transformed. The discussion is going on. And concerning Romania, because Romania was mentioned today several times, and probably this is Romania one of the countries where we have to put more emphasis. Concerning Romania, our position is very, very clear. We would like to see actually support the transition from institutional to community-based services for children, people with disabilities, and mental health problems, and elderly. So in all areas, we would like to see how the Romanian authorities will set up actually the priorities. Okay. Just a few words, really not going to the details of the programming. I'm using this slide to make it very clear that where the European Commission has a right and actually power to make interventions and where not. Okay, in the case of programming, we have all the rights, all the power to make it better and to really follow the European objectives. In the case of implementation, we are a bit isolated. So the European Commission has not really able to make interventions on the implementation level. So that's why it's very important now, today, by the end of this year, to make as much as possible efforts to improve the programming. Concerning the monitoring and evaluation, we both, the Member States and the European Commission, should make interventions, and we should make it better. I just made here some examples where actually the deinstitutionalization is relevant. Like say for the problem analysis, for the expected results, for the fulfillment of ex-ante conditionalities, for the involvement of partners. These are several different measures concerning the partnership agreement, where we would like to see how member states, they are focusing in particular on deinstitutionalization. So even now, without the ex-ante conditionality measure which were taken out by the Danish presidency, even now we can actually reinforce the need for this kind of actions. What's going on concerning the trialogue, very, very briefly. As I said, concerning the ex-ante conditionalities, our position and the European Parliament position has not changed, but the European Council still objects. Based on the latest information, we still don't know, actually, how this ex-ante condition measure could be reintroduced in the current regulatory package. Next week, there will be a political trialogue where commissioners, members of the European Parliament, ministers, they will meet and they will discuss actually these questions. And our position concerning the ex-ante conditionality is very clear. We would like to ask the European Council to reintroduce these measures. Concerning the fund-specific regulations, there is no significant objections concerning the investment priorities, which is a really very good news. And there's still a discussion about the 25% share of ESF in the total cohesion budget and the 20% for the social inclusion. So we are waiting for this kind of decisions as well. And as I said, concerning the common strategic framework, we have expected that it will be a delegated act, but it's not. So we will include all of these key actions to the thematic guidance on social inclusion, which will include, of course, deinstitutionalization. And some information about the bilateral informal dialogues, which is also going on. So first, we have received some reactions from the member states on the position papers. The priorities which we have set up, they were commented by the member states. Some positive and some negative comments we have received actually concerning the position papers. And based on these reactions, member states, they have already set up some priorities and they have sent it to us. And we started to discuss the priorities. So today we have seen mostly the priorities of the next programming period. And by the mid-June, actually, we are expecting the first drafts of the partnership agreements and afterwards the first drafts of the operational programs. In some cases, like for example, Czech Republic, we have already received the partnership agreement. In some cases, it's very funny because, for example, in the case of Bulgaria, we have not received the partnership agreement, but we have received the operational program. So, which we don't understand why it happened, but this has happened. Okay, and what kind of issues have been raised already? Some member states, they have raised the question that they don't have any data on institutionalization. This is the case of Poland, which we have to further discuss why you don't have data on institutionalization, what kind of data source you can use, and how you can react on that in your programs. No particular attention on the reform of the health and social services. Some of the member states, they simply neglect, I'm trying to be honest, the need for reform. So for example, in the case of health, we are expecting a move from the hospital-centric model to the community-based, not just for the DI, but in the whole system. And this is not the case, for example, in Romania. And that's what we have to discuss with the Romanian authorities, how they see this question. The cost-benefit aspect of the transition to community-based services is a very relevant one. Many member states, they have raised that whether this is cheaper or more expensive, what we have to do, because they're concerned that in the short term, it's probably more expensive than the institutional care. And I'm finishing. And the link to the labor market integration is completely missing concerning the deinstitutionalization. So that's what we have to reinforce. And we are producing some guidance for the member states. We are producing, we have already produced the ex-ante conditionality guidance. The ex-ante conditionality guidance, it's actually contains, so we have a reference to the missing, let's say the deleted measures, the thematic and the general ex-ante conditionalities. So it means that we are expecting that during the trialogue, that will be reintroduced. Because in our guidance, we still keep an eye on these deleted measures. Concerning the partnership agreement and on the operational program templates, we would like to reintroduce the deleted ex-ante condition measures. So if the trialogue will decide to reintroduce these measures, then we are happy to include it in the partnership and the operational program templates. And we are producing, we are in the middle of producing actually thematic guidance on social inclusion, including deinstitutionalization. And this is very much related to the social investment package. And some words about the social investment package, because I think we have to see some targeted investments for the deinstitutionalization, but we have to see the deinstitutionalization in the overall transformation of public services. And that's the main issue, that's the main message of the social investment package, which was actually released by the European Commission by February this year, that the public services, what we see today, they are not efficient and they are not responding actually to the societal challenges like aging, and they are not really responding to the economic crisis. So that's why the European Commission has raised a very important point. There's a need to reinforce the modernization of social policies to optimize their effectiveness and efficiency. And in the case of health services, you see here that we would like to see how member states, they are reinforcing the shift from the hospital-centered model to community-based care and integrated services. So again, it's not just this is not just about the DI, it's about all health services. So how member states, they would like to make more focus on the primary care, on community-based services, and to move away from the hospital-centric models. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm going to do essentially three things, apart from showing you a picture by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, which really demonstrates the connectedness between the UN Convention and the European Union, and the jump spark connection that we really should see. Of course, here, God is represented by the European Union, not the other way around. So I'm really going to do three things. I'm just going to, as it were, talk a little bit about the link between the UN Convention and EU law and policy. And I, off the record or on the record, completely agree with Jerome Bickenbach this morning that although this convention is called a Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, it's actually not about disability. It's about the universal human condition, and I guess it applies to everybody. And some of the really interesting thing about the ex-ante conditionalities is they too are not designated to one particular cohort, and I'll come back to that. So by definition, they have universal application if they were in fact to be reinstated into the draft regulations. Second thing, and this is really going over some of the ground that Andor has dealt with, but I really want to zone in on the key issues that remain for decision, because it's really important that your voice is heard in this process. Thus far, the voice of civil society has not really been heard in a loud and robust manner in the process, and now as we're turning the corner into the last stretch, it's really important that you get your say on this. And then I will put to you what some of the net questions for decision are. As it were, if I were American, I would say this is a segue into Howell's part, but it's a bridge into Howell's part, which comes in the next section. So first of all, just very, very brief reflection on the connectedness, why it's relevant that the UN Convention is brought into the loop. We shouldn't, of course, see the European Union simply as a platform for implementing universal conventions, but nevertheless, there is some line of connection between the two, and it's important to keep that chain in mind, so to speak. Very, very important to reflect and recall and remember that the EU itself, apart from, alongside, separate with its member states, has ratified this particular convention. So it means something, as I think Ines said earlier on, it hovers halfway beneath the treaties, but somewhat above secondary legislation. So it is of constitutional significance in the European Union public order. And I think that's incredibly important to remember. And the European Union, apart from its member states, will be held to account before the UN Committee, and I'll come back to that. The second thing is the decision of the Union to confirm, which is really another fancy word for ratify the convention, had to lodge with the United Nations a declaration of competency, because of course much of the competency is spread in a very complicated way between the Union and its member states. And the interesting thing is that in that annex, you will have the declaration of competency as illustrated in several spheres of policy and law and legislation, and the structural funds is there. It hits you in your face. So you can't make the argument that the convention is utterly disconnected or irrelevant to the structural funds. It's actually in the union's own declaration of competence, which may or may not have been drafted by Emma, but she's sitting right here in front of you. And I think it's really interesting. One of our member states, Hungary, has already been fingered by the monitoring body in the United Nations for what can you call it, the use of the structural funds to create institutions. I can't call it misuse, because of course the rules and regulations under structural funds thus far have been permissive towards states actually using them in that particular end. But of course, if you're coming at it through the lens of the UN Convention, it's a clear misuse of monies, no matter how it's sourced. The point, therefore, is that it's inevitable that the EU itself will be probed hard by the UN Committee, and if this permissiveness is allowed to continue to let's say, not forestall certain uses of the funds, the EU will be found legally liable. Make no mistake about it. So, secondly, the proposals for the new regulations and the current status of the negotiations. I think we have to back up a little bit, because the structural funds is really a financial instrument to try and deliver on key European strategic priorities. And these priorities are set out in EU 2020, which to me frankly admits our economic model has failed and our social model has failed, and we need social innovation to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The interesting thing about EU 2020 is it provides several flagship initiatives, one of which is in a European platform against poverty. And key elements of that talk about designing and implementing programs to promote social innovation. This is really all about social innovation for the most vulnerable. Define and implement measures addressing the specific circumstances of group at risk. And by the way, that's all encompassing. It covers older people along with people with disabilities, along with many others. So this is really the policy framework hovering out there. This is our prism through which we refract the UN Convention, and then we move on to the structural funds as a way of trying to achieve and implement these overall European strategic priorities. There are many structural funds or cohesion instruments, as Andor and Howell will point out to you, but the three that really concern us are the general draft regulation that covers the next programming period for all of the cohesion funds, and that's where the rubber hits the road. And then the instrument-specific regulations, most of which have been left intact by Council in a very welcome manner. I guess the point about it, though, is that, as Emma was pointing out earlier, there are several very positive Commission position papers on appropriate uses of these funds, but it's still voluntary. There's no way in which you can nudge a state or condemn a state or monitor a state for not actually complying with these position papers. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the missing link in this chain and restoring that missing link. To its immense credit, the European Commission had provided that link in its draft, but as you've seen, the Danish presidency, presumably under pressure from the member states, took those conditionalities out. A little bit technical here. When I came across a book on the structural funds, the law of the structural funds 5 years ago, I said to myself, what madman would write that? But then I got into it, and it's actually quite compelling once you do. But a little bit of a mystery, and it requires a little bit of demystification, which Andor has done a very good job on. The important point about it is that Annex 4 to the draft general regulation contains what's called ex-ante conditionalities. Let me demystify that for you. Previously, you could access the social funds and use it pretty much whatever way you wished under some general guidance. Now you have access to the structural funds if the ex-ante conditionalities are put in, provided you show that you comply with the ex-ante conditionalities. You self-assess in first instance, Ireland, Romania, Bulgaria, whatever, but then the Commission can, as it were, second guess or come back and monitor and potentially suspend all payment unless you prove that you're going to come into compliance within a 2-year window. And that's incredibly important. 2 ex-ante conditionalities are explicitly relevant to disability in the draft general regulation put forward by the European Commission. One has to do with this thematic 10th priority, which is really a tie-back to EU 2020. It's really their way of trying to deliver on EU 2020 on promoting social inclusion and combating poverty. And the second one has to do with a general thematic priority, which was discrimination, which is broad and covered several issues and several grounds, but also specifically included disability. The Russian here, I'm told, is the old Russian adage, trust but verify. And therefore, that's why process was particularly important in the draft regulation. Some disinterested entity like the European Commission should have SESN or competence to be able to oversee whether or not these conditionalities are met, and whether or not, in fact, payment ought to be suspended in egregious cases. And I believe both have been weakened. Both the ex-ante conditionalities have been taken out, and the quality and the depth and the extent of the monitoring to be performed by the Commission has also been considerably weakened. So, just to give you a sense of it, and Andor has already spoken about this, but it's no harm repeating it because this is what's at issue. The first ex-ante conditionality of relevance, for example, to disability, as I said, came under the chapeau of integration of marginalised communities and active inclusion, combating poverty. And it was that there ought to be the existence and implementation of a national strategy for poverty reduction. The criteria fulfillment was a national strategy is in place that includes measures for the shift from residential to community-based care. Let me repeat, you can't access the funds unless this is in place, period. Council removed this several months ago, and basically one of the core issues before the negotiators is should it be reinstated. And as far as I can gather, both the Commission and the European Parliament are steadfast in insisting that it be reinstated. There's also an element of this that deals explicitly with the employment opportunities of people with disability, but in the interest of time, I will move on. The second ex-ante conditionality of relevance had to do with what was called a general strand of ex-ante conditionalities that was not pegged back to one of the 9 or 10 strategic priorities of EU 2020, but was freestanding and traversal. It crossed all of the grounds, so to speak. And it was the existence of a mechanism which ensures effective implementation and application of the UN Convention. And it went into some detail about the granularity of that. That's a great phrase of my friend Jerome Bickenbach, which I never fail to use on occasion. And I won't go into that in any great detail, but in a sense it says, here's the message. Unless you want to access UN money, EU money, you're not going to be able to do it unless you show you're really serious about translating the majestic generalities of the UN Convention into something that's hard and meaningful in domestic law and practice and procedure. So there are the ex-ante conditionalities in the general reg. They're incredibly important. The general regulation is the portal into the fund-specific regulations. But just to bring out the point, and Andor already mentioned this, there's some very good stuff in those fund-specific regulations which actually become fiction unless these conditionalities are restored. Or they may become fact, but whether it's fact or fiction is left up to the sovereign prerogative of the state. And that's wrong, because that exposes the EU to legal liability. So one of them was transition from institutional to community-based services in the European Regional Development Fund. Very important, because that's the fund that's used to build bricks and mortar. That's the fund that will enable you to transition from a home of 1,000 into a home of 50. But as someone was emphasizing this morning, that's not a home, that's an institution. Call it by any other name you want. Okay, so I just move on. That remains, but nevertheless it's not enforceable, so to speak. Also, the European Social Fund has some really excellent stuff in there about promoting equal opportunities and transitioning from institutional to community-based care. That's incredibly important because staff development has to be turned around to enable people to assume new roles in a different kind of social model that's evolving into the future. There's a lot of other good stuff in the draft regs on, for example, the process of consultation with civil society in putting together your national frameworks and in monitoring your national frameworks, and presumably people with disabilities have equal access to those frameworks as others. But the main point is that the ex-ante conditionalities renders a lot of these positive accomplishments probably fictional, because states will still have permission to ignore them since the the conditionalities are not in place. So the General Affairs Council in April rejected the disability proportion of Theme 10. That was really the one on transitioning from institutions to community care. and all of the general ex-ante conditionalities under non-discrimination. Council did not propose any substantive changes to the instrument-specific regulations on the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund. The European Parliament, for its part, gave itself a mandate to enter into trialogue negotiations between Council, Commission and Parliament in November of last year. There's been several meetings. I have 3 noted there. There may well have been others since then. And the process has morphed from a technical dialogue into a political dialogue between the Council under the Presidency, the Commission and the Parliament under the aegis of the Irish Presidency. What are the issues for decision? Here's my segue into Howell's section later on. Should the concept of transitioning from institutions to community-based services be reinstated into the draft regulations? For my part, that's slam dunk. Obviously it should. Should the disability-specific language in the thematic heading General Ex-ante Conditionalities on effective implementation and monitoring of the Convention be reinstated? Yes, otherwise everything remains potentially fictional and therefore needlessly exposes the European Union to legal liability before the United Nations. If the ex-ante conditionalities cannot be reinstated, is there something else that could be inserted with equal effect? Personally, I doubt it. I think you're looking at something that has strong leveraging possibilities, that precludes spending money in a certain direction, but also tries to effectively nudge states in the right direction. Bear in mind that these member states are also obliged under the UN Convention quite separately. So sooner or later, someone is going to be called to answer, and sooner or later, the European Union is going to be hauled before the UN Committee. Do the regulations do enough to advance the rights of older people? No, I wouldn't have thought so. However, if we flash back to the general ex-ante conditionality on transitioning from institutions to community care, note carefully that language did not telescope it down to disability. It presumably covers both children in institutions, older people in danger of entering into institutions prematurely, as well as people with disabilities, of whom there are like 2 million almost in European institutions. Think of the amount of money we're wasting in Europe. If you want to study further, read the study we did with Jan Jarob. Jan is up there pondering what I'm saying. We said in a follow-up paper with the Equal Rights Trust in London, the European Union is facing a major test of its sincerity and commitment to the UN Convention. Current and positive proposals from the European Commission designed to bring the structural funds into alignment with UN treaty law are under pressure from Council. Failure to take the CRPD seriously will needlessly expose the EU and its member states to international legal liability, and so on and so forth. Now, Minister Kathleen Lynch this morning was forthcoming and told you to please visit Cork. Well, here's my plea for tourism in the west of Ireland. This is taken not so far from my house, so please stay in Galway and you can visit Cork the next time round. Thank you very much.
My presentation will introduce you to 2 publications we produced as the European Expert Group on the transition from institutional to community-based care. We'll call the European Expert Group on deinstitutionalization. And these are the common European guidelines and the toolkit on using the European Union funds for the process of transition. Both of these 2 documents, their aim is to one of their aims is to ensure that we do spend structural funds much better in the next programming period, and I will show you how they aim to achieve that. First of all, I would like to tell you a couple of words about the European Expert Group, which has been mentioned a couple of times already today. So this is a broad coalition gathering stakeholders representing different groups of, first of all, service users and users who tend to be placed in institutional care because they have support needs which are not currently met in the community. And these are children with and without disabilities, people with disabilities, including people with mental health problems, and their families are represented as well. And since recently, we also have the homeless people represented in the expert group, as also a group which tends to be placed in institutions. On the expert group, we also have representatives of the service providers, of public authorities and intergovernmental organizations. These are the Office of the UNOHCHR and UNICEF. Even before this conference, we've realized it's important to work together and to bring all these strengths together and to discuss the common ways of moving away from institutional care to services in the community. Before we published the guidelines and the toolkit, the group started its work by producing the so-called Spidla report, which is the ad hoc expert group report on the transition from institutional to community-based care, which outlined the main principles of moving towards community living and drew attention to some of the risks and challenges the countries are facing during this process. And you can find this report, of course, online. We also work closely with the European Commission, and Andor is one of them, mainly with DG Regio and DG Employment, because these two departments manage the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund, but also with DG Justice. We have come quite a long way since the starting days of the group in 2009 in fostering this cooperation and getting the Commission to work better with us on ensuring that structural funds are used in a better way. And we have been very happy, of course, with the draft regulations, which have included specifically the transition from institutional to community-based care as one of the thematic objectives. And also, of course, we have welcomed the ex-ante conditionalities, which have been mentioned before. So I think we have come a long way there. We have still a long way to go, of course. We have also worked directly with some of the member states, in particular Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, also trying to make sure they use the structural funds in a better way. So this is about the expert group. In terms of why the guidelines, I would like to quote again the Council of Europe previous Human Rights Commissioner, Thomas Hammerberg, who did his office did an excellent paper on independent living, and who said, wrote, though governments increasingly recognize the inevitability of deinstitutionalization, there is less clarity with regard to the mechanisms that replace institutionalization and what would constitute a human rights-based response. And I think this is one of the real issues. Deinstitutionalization and independent living have become a sort of buzzword, but what that means in practice and how do you support people to live in the community, how do you support children to live with their families, no matter what support needs they have, that is more difficult. And we have heard just now the issue of group homes for a large number of children, the so-called homes for 50 people. I mean, these are obviously not solutions to or alternatives to institutionalization. They are just further ways of institutionalizing people. So with the guidelines, we wanted to provide some practical advice on how do you move away from institutional care to real inclusion and community living. They are aimed mainly, of course, I've put here not the member states, but of course also countries outside the European Union. And they're also aimed at EU institutions that can play a role in supporting this transition. We have included examples of good practice. This is very important because we are sometimes talking about this as if it's community living, as if it's something very new, but in fact a lot of countries have gone a long way in including people in the communities. There is a lot of good practice, and there is no reason why this good practice cannot be implemented in Bulgaria or in Romania or in other countries that are at the very beginning of the process. We have aimed to raise awareness about the right to live in the community as such. We often hear that some people will always need institutional care. Well, that is not correct. The right to community living does apply to everyone, at least at the moment to people with disabilities, but there have been, what we have included in the guidelines as well, because of the links with the disability and aging as well, we can say that for older people as well, we can presume they have such right as well. We would like to ensure, which I've said before, that both the EU funding but also the national funding goes towards funding services in the community, not continued institutionalization. And we very much promote the involvement of users themselves and their organizations in the whole process of moving away from institutional care. The key elements of the guidelines, so they're called common, not because they're common to all European countries, but because they're common to the different user groups. So children, people with disabilities, people with mental health problems, and older people who are not represented on our expert group, but who are included as a target group, as a group of beneficiaries in the guidelines. We realize that the member states are not all starting from the same position, so the guidelines therefore are not written as a step-by-step process, but outline the key elements of the process of moving away from institutional care. In each chapter of the guidelines, we highlighted links to the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, to Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the European Convention on Human Rights. Because if the governments, and we've heard a lot of times today, how many member states ratified the convention, well, so if they would like to do something about implementing the convention, they can use our guidelines to make sure they do so. Of course, we have highlighted the risks and challenges in the process, hoping that some countries might want to avoid them. I'd like to say that throughout the guidelines, our emphasis is on the management of the process and the cross-sectoral cooperation. This is what we often see missing, the necessary cooperation between the different government departments, like the Ministry of Social Affairs, Health, Education, Finance, Transport. All these need to be working together to ensure that services that are developed really cater to all the different needs of the individuals. Under deinstitutionalization, I think Camilla has mentioned some myths about this whole area. We are not talking just about the closure of the buildings and letting the people fend for themselves. Whichever way they can. We are talking about replacing these institutions with individual services in the community, services that will prevent institutionalization in the first place. And we are talking about this process involving the transfer of resources from one system to another, which is very important. But also we are talking about the closure of institutions. We don't want the two systems running in parallel. And the moratorium on the new admissions into institutions. All this will lead to, in the end, people living in the community. Importantly, we're not talking about just about specialized services, but making mainstream services that we all use available also to people who have additional support needs. Just quickly, I will just run through the 10 elements of the guidelines. So we are starting with why embark on the process of deinstitutionalization. assessment of the situation. This is what was mentioned by Andor, that in Poland they don't know, I don't know how many people they have in the institutions. So this is very important, obviously, who is in the institution, who is in the community that needs support, etc., to be able to then make a plan for what needs to be done. Developing strategies and action plans and making sure they don't stay just declarative, that they are actually implemented. Establishing the legal framework for community-based services. One of these is the issue of the legal capacity, which I know also the center here is working on. Then what are some of the services in the community that need to be developed? How to move funding away from institutions to community-based services, developing individual plans, how that is done and why that is important to ensure personalized support. How do you support individuals and communities during the transition? As the minister mentioned, which I don't agree with, that some people want to live in institutions. Well, it could be because some of these things were done in the wrong way, and the people, for example, through the process of moving from an institution to the community, haven't received the adequate support. Then the very important, the quality standards, which need to be different for community-based services, of course, than they currently are for institutional care, and how to make sure that people who will be supporting others in the community are there and available on time and trained well and supported, etc. So these are the elements of the guidelines. It's quite a big document, but I encourage you to read it. Now, why the toolkit? This is just an illustration of how the funds were used so far between 2007 and 2013. And these are the countries where we have clear evidence that the money was used for renovation, modernization, and building of new institutions. And this is pretty much corresponds to Andor's map of the less developed regions. So it's not dollars going into the toilet, but it is euros, that millions of euros that have been wasted for the wrong type of services, and not only have been wasted, but that will contribute to further segregation of people, and that will make it more difficult now to close these places that have received millions of euros of investment. So this is why we need to think, how can we change this in the new programming period, which is what we have been trying to do with the toolkit. I should say that there might be more countries that need to be added to that, but as I'm going to mention, monitoring is a big issue when it comes to structural funds, mainly because of the lack of transparency by the member states in how they are used. So if we had more information, we might be able to add a couple of more countries to this picture. So the key elements of the toolkit, the beginning part, I wouldn't say a lot about. It's mainly what Andor was talking about, the regulations, the draft regulations, and Gerard as well. So we are setting up the context for how structural funds should be used in the new programming period. We then go through the three stages that Andor mentioned, or four stages: the programming, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. And this is I think, the key point, because regulations are the very beginning. It is important that they're good, but they don't mean anything if nobody makes sure that they are implemented. And if the Commission cannot take, if there are no consequences, it's not enough to tell the member states you shouldn't do this, but if they still can go on and invest into institutions without this money being taken away from them, then they're of no use. So we think this first stage of the programming is very important, when the countries are preparing their partnership agreements and the operational programs. Because, I mean, for two reasons. First of all, we want to make sure that that they allocate enough money to this sector, to the social reform, the reform of services. Second of all, we want to make sure that they put in the right actions that will then enable the development of community-based services using the structural funds. It is important for us as a civil society to be watchful at this time, but also for the Commission to, and this is what Andor said, that this is the part where the Commission can do a lot. So we need to work together to make sure that we have good programming documents in the end. And the toolkit will help you through this with the various checklists we have come up with on how to make sure that the right things are put into these documents. The implementation is the next crucial stage, because I think in this area, the devil really is in the detail. If the program is called Independent Living Center, it could be an institution for 200 people. It doesn't mean that it is real Center for Independent Living, but as we would understand it in Ines, for example. So we need to watch very carefully here the kind of calls for proposals the member states are issuing and react, and also for the Commission has reacted before. So we need to make sure that we stop projects that are further segregate disabled people. So this is we have the checklist for implementation here. The next step is the monitoring and evaluation, and hopefully more also NGOs will get involved in this process, because not many are involved in the member states in monitoring how structural funds are used. But we also need the help of the Commission to make sure that the member states are forced to make this information public and more transparent, and that we can actually see where the funding is going. And it is important that we pay when it comes to monitoring. So far, only the technical details have been monitored, where how if the formal procedures were done correctly, the tendering, etc. But nobody really looked at, okay, so how does this money, how has it benefited or not benefited the group of people that it was aimed for, what were the final results? Nobody at all was looking at that. I think not the Commission, not the member states. So it is important that we monitor really what is important, and that is the final effect of these projects that are being funded through the structural funds. And again, we have included in the toolkit some indicators, output and result indicators that can help with that, both for the European Social Fund and the Regional Development Fund. And I would just like to end by saying that there is a great potential of using structural funds in a better way, and this is based on the draft regulations. The Commission has emphasized that they need to be used to support structural change, so not ad hoc projects that will not really have any effect on any positive effect on the target groups or the system as such. It is important that the two funds are used, the ESF and ERDF are used in the same, together in an integrated way, that they support sustainable reform, promote social innovation, and thankfully the rules have apparently will be simplified also to make this whole process easier. So I would end with that, and just to say, this has been said, so I will not repeat. But the guidelines and the toolkit are available in a number of languages. They are for free, so it sounds like I'm selling them, but you can download them for free from our website in a number of European languages. And of course, as the expert group, we welcome comments, feedback, and any questions. So thank you very much.
It's a great privilege to ask the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Aging and the Administrator of the Administration for Community Living, Cathy Greenlee, to address the conference. Cathy, can you hear us and see us?
I can hear you and see you both.
Good.
Good afternoon in Ireland. So I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in the conference and be with you this afternoon virtually for the video conference. When Professor Quinn and I first talked about the conference, I was very hopeful. Just a second. I've got to feedback that. I have to fix something on my end here. I was very hopeful to be able to join you in person, and that would have been my preference. I, in March of this year, was in a very unfortunate position of needing to cut the budget of my particular agency, and that cut resulted in millions of dollars being lost at the state and local level for older people and their families. I couldn't very well justify coming in person when we're making such significant cuts because of the problems with our federal budget here in the United States. So I'm glad to join you. I would have preferred to be there, but to see the people in person who were in the room. But Professor Quinn, it would be easier for me to tour Galway, as you have instructed, if I were there with you. So I won't be doing that, but that was on my list. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the convention because I believe you want me to talk about the U.S. experience. But I would be remiss if I skipped it altogether. President Obama, within his first year as president, signed the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's something that his administration is very committed to. It was December of last year that the United States Congress failed to ratify the convention. The president, following that vote, issued a very strong statement of his continued commitment and his desire to continue to work with Congress to pass the convention. We understand that we have been very successful and very committed in this country for several decades in supporting the rights of people with disabilities, and that will not change. And in fact, much of what's reflected in the convention comes straight from our prior work with Americans with Disabilities. So we'll keep working at this particular work. What I would like to talk about is the Administration for Community Living, and the first year, because it's been about a year now. It was in April a year ago that we created ACL. The President in June of 2009 put together an initiative he called the Year of Community Living, stating his commitment to supporting people with disabilities as they age, living in the community. At that time, I had come to Washington and started to work as the Assistant Secretary for Aging with colleagues here who work in the field of disability. And it was really from those conversations that we decided ourselves that we wanted to create this new organization. And I think that's important for everyone to understand, that the Administration for Community Living wasn't a new structure that we were forced to do or was forced on us, but a real recognition from those of us working with people with disabilities and older adults that we actually needed to do this work together in the same agency. And so we had from the beginning not only the support of the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but the support of the White House in doing this, because it very much reflects the commitment of the entire administration. But it was really born from those of us who do the work. So the three of us that were key came from the field of aging, the person who is the lead in the United States government for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and the key policy advisor at Health and Human Services, who worked on disability policy for people with disabilities of all ages. He himself also has a physical disability and came from the field of independent living. So we came together to form the Administration for Community Living. We were very deliberate. I'm going to need some water or something. We were very deliberate in choosing community living as the name for a couple of reasons. First, it's aspirational. It's what all people want to do, live in their communities. I've never met an older person who wanted as their life goal, as their retirement goal, to live in a nursing home. Some of them end up making that choice. All people aspire to live in their community. So we feel like we're the only federal agency that has an aspirational name that reflects the many people that we're serving. It was also very important as we co-located aging and disability that one not report to the other. And it was very important as the Assistant Secretary for Aging that I not ever work with people with disabilities and their advocates in a way where they felt that they reported to me from the field of aging or to the field of aging. So I have this joint title of Assistant Secretary for Aging as well as Administrator of the new organization that we've created so that we can work in partnership. This partnership, I believe, is very successful, but the success depends on an equal footing as we all do this work together. Our goal at the Administration for Community Living and our fundamental value is that we believe that all persons, regardless of age, including children, deserve the right to live at home in their community, in communities that value their support and value their inclusion, and that we be able to work together as federal agencies to support that particular goal. So we have a common vision that everyone will be able to live in the community. That doesn't mean that the people that we serve all have the exact same needs. A person, an old person with Alzheimer's, a child with a developmental disability, a middle-aged adult with a physical disability, these are different kinds of people with different kinds of needs. Our expectation of ourselves is that we see the unique differences and the different backgrounds, different histories of these individuals, but also their common goals, and that we work in a space where we can do both. We never have attempted and never will attempt to combine the fields of aging and disability into one field. We think that doing that would actually be a failure, not a success. The histories, particularly in this country, of people with disabilities and older adults are different histories. Mr. Hayden talked about the history of institutionalizing people with disabilities. We have that history, which I think is a very shameful history in this country, of warehousing and institutionalizing people with disabilities. And we have moved to the place that we are because people with disabilities really claim their own civil right to live in community. And we must respect that as we work with people with disabilities. In the field of aging, we don't really come in this country to the work on aging from the same disability perspective, but more a sense of the life course, and the fact that ageism exists, and the need to address people as they become older and more frail. That's not all of the same work, but there's an intersection in space where we all come together, and that main intersection for us is around the conversation and the policies related to long-term supports and services. How do we provide adequate services and supports to all of these individuals so that they can live successful lives in their communities as they choose and want to do? The means for achieving that goal, living in the community, is actually a little bit different for people with disabilities and seniors. As we talk about the means or objectives, for example, youth with developmental disabilities, we will need to tackle employment policy and make sure that youth transition to adulthood with an adequate way to be engaged in their own life, to find financial support, economic independence. That's a little bit different than working with an older person who needs to manage multiple medications or deal with late stages of Alzheimer's. So these are slightly different, but in the middle, there's so much common policy that needs to be developed that we are stronger if we develop this policy together. So 1 year later, as we celebrate the anniversary, I am absolutely convinced that what we have done was not only needed at this point in time, but also is very much determinative of where we will go in this country and internationally in the future. Pardon me. I think we are being successful, and we will continue to be successful. And the way that I have begun to discuss our work with our stakeholders, with other federal partners, is describing what we are doing as building an organization that is multicultural in nature. Professor Quinn, you and I talked a few months ago. I hadn't come upon this particular structure as a way to describe the work, but I find that it's resonating because most of us understand the basics of what multiculturalism means. It's a basic recognition that people are all very different, but people are also people. They're very much the same, and that both of these things are true. It doesn't mean that everyone is always the same or has the same opinion but that in doing multicultural work, aging culture, disability culture, that the root of that is a deep respect for the difference and the commonality, and the deep commitment to working on these goals together, and not in any way canceling out or erasing the other person's values or their histories. And also making a commitment, if you're working in the field of aging, to becoming competent and conversant about how to work with people with disabilities and advocate disability policy so they don't work in opposite or in opposition to each other. And that we do this space together, do this work together. I have found that this has been one of the most interesting years of my life, of my professional career, that we have had many successes. We're sort of building something and learning and making mistakes all at the same time. And it has been a phenomenal year and a phenomenal endeavor. There are many conversations I've had this last year where I wondered how we ever did this work separately. That we are the only ones, actually, in the field of aging and disability who understand each other, even though there are differences. The role of the institution is a huge cultural policy and program difference in these fields. But we can find a way to advance the policy at the same time without necessarily expecting that for all populations will be identical, but how to do this in a way that's culturally competent. So we will continue to work to build our new organization. To really be successful in the United States, though, something else is required of us, and that's what we're engaged on in our second year. The Administration for Community Living at the federal agency, at the federal level, is a very small organization. We have some program dollars that we send to the states and some services that we provide in the community. By and large, our role and the way we see ourselves, even by U.S. statute, is to be advocates for the populations that we're serving. Much of the issues that you're talking about in terms of the EU structural funds, the investments, are not managed by my organization. So the parallel would be a sister organization within my large department where we're making investments both at the federal level and at the state level in community services. So we can be good advocates and we can find a way to work policy together, but ultimately to be successful we have to bring the financiers to the table. So what we are doing now within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services at the direction of the Secretary is we've convened a department-wide council to create a new strategic plan for the entire agency. So while I'm working on a strategic plan for my agency, for Administration for Community Living, we are creating a new strategic plan for the Department of Health and Human Services so that we can make sure that we bring to bear all the assets of this huge federal agency to make sure that we're all aligned in our investments, in our policy, on behalf of people with disabilities of all ages and older adults so that we can do this work together. And that conversation is quite complicated in a positive way, but we talk about the workforce investments that we make because all people will need in-home services and supports. We talk about access and who do you call? All people, different kinds of people can call one place to get support. We talk about quality, and we talk about the relationship to the healthcare system, which are also two things that those of you who've preceded me on the panel have also talked about. We are doing a tremendous amount of work in the United States with regard to transforming our healthcare system. The role of community living is to take the programs that have always been doing this work and figure out how to translate it into a healthcare setting so that we can integrate these services more completely. And so that we know how health and human services integrate, how a hospital and community services integrate. We find sometimes we need translators, that the roles that we live in the community and the hospital with medical providers are often very different. People we see as people, they see as patients. How we work on transitions when someone's discharged from the hospital to go to the home. This is very much the type of work that will be embedded in a broader policy as we develop a strategic plan for aging plans. There are a couple of different things you all have mentioned this afternoon with regard to measurement that I wanted to specifically call out because they are currently very much in conversation here. One professor Quinn, I believe you were talking about, no, it was Mr. Ürmös, we were talking about whether or not we should measure the transition from institutions to community, and whether or not members of the EU are willing to make a commitment in their organizing documents to make that kind of measurement. When I hang out with people from the fields of research and evaluation, they feel very strongly that what gets measured gets done. And in this case, I believe that that is in fact what has been successful in the United States. There was a report that was very instrumental to me before I came to Washington that AARP, a big national civil society organization, produced. It was produced in 2008. And they really measured for each of the U.S. states their success in rebalancing their system from institutions to community for people with physical disabilities and older adults. And I used that. I carried it around when I was working at a state level to educate policymakers about the need to rebalance. That same organization, within the last year, created a scorecard to start trying to measure now in the community how are we doing when we deliver our services. So the woman who spoke just right before me, Ms. Bulic, you talked about this just very briefly, about quality measures in the community. This is actually an enormous conversation, because as we do successful work in integration between health services and community services, the objective is not to medicalize the work that's being done in the community, but to value a different type of measurement about quality. And quality has to have a health-related component. People need to get good care. But also part of the essential work in the community is social inclusion, which you all also mentioned. How do we measure this type of quality? This, at this point in the United States, is still a very new conversation, even though we've been committed to community living for many decades. Quality measurement, I think, is still a little bit behind, because so much of what we've done has been focused on healthcare outcome or healthcare measurement. From here, the work also bleeds across our federal agency to the other federal partners. They have the issues that you will be working on for people to successfully live in their communities. There must be adequate housing, so we must work with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We must have an adequate workforce who can provide in-home support, so we must work with the Department of Labor. And we also must figure out transportation issues. In this country, transportation continues to be an enormous challenge for all of us. Whether you're in a rural part of the country where there's no public transportation, or whether you're in large cities where transportation and mobility can be a huge problem as people try to navigate very congested urban environment and use public transportation. So these are the bigger issues that we will face here, that you will face in the European Union. And I think it's what we all have very much in common. I'm absolutely convinced that we are on the right path, and the days when we disagree are actually days of instruction. But I've not in any way felt like we were doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. I think we're working to lead and very much want to work with you and work with the advocates. Because it all started with private conversations about this being the best thing to do. And the proof really is that the advocates who are working with us at the state and local level have embraced this concept. And we find in this country better alignment between the fields of aging and disability than I've ever seen in the past. So thank you very much for inviting me.